are you doing? Welcome back to Strategies and Missions. Today I'm in Birmingham, Alabama. I came down to see my friend Dr. Don Barger. He's a graduate of Mid-America Theological Seminary, and he also works for the International Mission Board. I'll let him tell you his official title, but basically he's the guru for orality for the International Mission Board. And that's what we're going to be looking at this week. So Donnie, thanks so much for being with us today.
Yeah, it's good to be here. And I wouldn't say that I'm the guru, but it is something I'm very interested in.
Okay, so then what is orality? How would you describe orality for somebody that's never heard that term?
So for us in the United States, we've grown up with the access to God's Word in a variety of forms. We have multiple copies of the Bible. We can open up our iPhones and have dozens of English language translations. But for most of the world, or most of the unreached world, much of the world, they don't have access to God's Word in a print form. And in many cases, there's a lot of people groups that aren't print-based people groups. So they may not have anything written in their language. Their entire language may be an oral-only language. So for those people groups, then the challenge for missionaries who are working with them is, so what do we do? What do we use to communicate God's Word to people who do not use print media, who do not have, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they can't read, it doesn't necessarily mean that they don't have things printed, but in some cases that's the case. And so it's really like a spectrum. So it's easy to get painted into a corner where somebody will say, well, no, my people group, they can read. So the question should be, do they read? How do they read? To what level do they read? And then what are our resources that we're using? Are they print-based for an oral culture, or are we trying to reach people how they learn? So what is their appropriate learning style?
Okay, that raises a question that I hear very often. Talking about oral people, someone might say, oh, well, they don't read. Well, why don't we send people in and teach them literacy, and then they can have written material?
Yeah, so I think there's not a either or. I think that's a good lofty goal, but for many people groups, that's a goal that's going to take generations to realize. So if I say that I love using Bible stories and I teach people using Bible stories and I would advocate people using storying for sharing the gospel, it doesn't mean I'm against written Bible translation. It doesn't mean that I'm against people learning how to read. And it just recognizes that how the people group that I'm working with learn best is through stories. And it could be their culture, their history, or absolute lack of access to God's Word. So where we can, we always want to work with Bible translators who are working to translate the Bible. We want to help them. But a New Testament translation for a people group that doesn't have an alphabet or nothing written down, I mean, it could take you 20 years to get a Bible. It could be done much quicker. There's some really cool new ways of doing Bible translation that speeds that process up for some people groups, but not for all. But it's still a long-term project to get the New Testament. And is the New Testament enough? So we've got the New Testament, so we're good. Well, we would say, no, you need access to all of God's Word. And so storying is not Bible translation, but we adhere to many of the Bible translation principles. We adhere to those same models for how translations are done, written translations. We use those same tools and same models for oral Bible storying, and I think we're going to get to that a little bit later.
Okay. Well, you've been talking back and forth using two terms that are similar, orality and storying, and then actually, I guess a third term, Bible storying. So what's the difference?
So orality is really a learning style. So it's much broader than, say, Bible storying or storying. Actually, if you read a lot of the business world in Western business how-to books or best practices books, Patrick Lencioni is probably the master of weaving what he calls leadership fables. So he'll write a book, and it's a written book, although most people listen to them on tape or on Audible. But it's a written book, and it's got 3 stories interwoven about real life business problems, challenges. And so this is a totally secular approach, but it really plays on the narrative and on the way people learn best. And if you read a Patrick Lencioni book, and he's got dozens of them, the last 20 pages of the book is really the meat of the how-to and the theory, but probably the first 140 pages of the book are examples of these 3 fictitious, probably not so fictitious, fables of failed leadership of some sort. So storying or orality, using orality, so it could be telling Bible stories, it could be interacting with people who learn best orally. So that could be listening to a story, it could be really watching is using more senses than just reading something. So I know it's called orally, which would mean you want to hear, but there is a difference between oral, A-U-R, than oral, O-R. Oh, so yeah, oral and oral. So oral is actually hearing, but oral is this idea of a communication style. So then actually, if you work with deaf people and you're doing their learning style is a much more oral learning style, which seems like, well, wait a minute, they can't hear. What do you mean it's oral? So it's not oral in the sense of oral, but it's oral in the way that they process that information. So there's lots of people groups that process that like that. And I would argue that in the United States, a significant amount of our population would be oral learners. It certainly does not mean that they cannot read, but it just means that given the choice between studying something in print or hearing the story, they're going to prefer to learn through story. So that's an oversimplification of a very complicated topic, but that's kind of an example, and maybe you're one of those. You asked also about Bible storying. It would be taking the stories that you find, the narratives that you find in the Bible, and then telling those stories in a way that someone could peel out those truths, the biblical truths. And so we're faithful to God's word. We don't ad lib. This is not Veggie Tales. We are telling a clear, accurate, natural version of the story, but we're telling it orally as a narrative.
Well, I know that you grew up in the United States, went to a literate school system, all the way through getting your PhD. So obviously your background is in literacy. How did you come to be interested in orality?
Good question. So I have an undergraduate degree in accounting, so about the most literate thing you can do, I guess. And then I was in seminary, and while I was at seminary at Southwestern, I worked in the library.
We say Brand X.
Oh, yeah, I gotcha. I see. So, by the way, I'm going to get a cup of coffee from my Mid-America mug. I was in the library, yet another literate example, the largest theological library in the world at the time. I was working, and part of my job was to process interlibrary loans from other libraries. And I kept seeing all these book requests coming in from a Dr. Lovejoy. And I thought, man, these are all really odd books. Uncle Remus books and story books, and it looked like children's books to me. And I was kind of giving his secretary a hard time one day when she came in to pick some stuff up. And she said, well, you should talk to him next time he comes through. I'm sure he'd love to explain it to you. So he did. He came through. And I remember saying, okay, you got to fill me in. Why are you requesting all this? You're a preaching professor. Why are you requesting all of these books and resources and tapes on stories? And so for the next hour or so, we visited about storying. And I was going into missions. And so this was my first semester in school. So from there on out, I became convinced that this was a good model for where we were going to serve, and I needed to learn everything I could. So every paper I could write in seminary, I did on orality. Also my dissertation, I did on orality. Hint, if you were thinking about doing a dissertation on orality, Mid-America will not let you do an oral dissertation. So
But your written dissertation was quite good.
It was finished finally.
So you finished and you went overseas with the International Mission Board. You were serving cross-culturally. How did orality function? We're going to talk more specifically about the 5 parts,
Yeah.
but just in general, what was the role of orality in your ministry on the field?
So we moved to a very rural part of the Dominican Republic. We lived on the border of Haiti, about 5 kilometers from Haiti, and the people where we lived primarily grew rice, worked on banana plantations. There certainly were some educated people there. It was the provincial capital of our province. But of the 12 or so thousand people who lived there, the vast majority were people who worked in the fields and such. And so I remember working with a guy named Miguel, and I was trying to do storying with him, and I was brand new and didn't have any other missionaries around, so I was making more mistakes than not. And I remember thinking, even though I had been studying this for 3 years and I had tried to use it some in the United States, I remember, like when I was in the States, I would use it in some apartment ministries, and we kind of combined a Bible story that was written, or a Bible study that was written with a Bible story, and I would tell the story, but then there was this fill in the blank piece. Don't do that. So we worked with Miguel, and I look over there like the second week, and his fill in the blank book that I had silly me printed out for him was totally upside down, and he did not know that the book was upside down. And so then I had to, in a very careful way, not bring shame to him for him not being able to read, but I didn't want to say, oh Miguel, you can't read. But I should have known that. I should have known that quickly, because where we lived, we didn't have any local TV stations or such. They beamed in from the capital if you had the ability to get that. But we had a radio station in town, and that radio station played merengue and bachata 23 hours a day. But from 7 a.m. till 8 a.m., there were 3 lawyers who got a newspaper that was sent up on the bus earlier in the morning, and they would read the newspaper to everyone in the city. And everybody listened to the newspaper being read. And it hit me finally that the way news, the way information was distributed in our community was through story. And so they didn't just read the newspaper and just read it word for word, but they would read it, and they would come and they would process the news for you, and they would tell you what was happening around the world. So we used storying. We began to use story more and more. I remember some of the first people that became Christians did through using sort of a quasi-literate oral model, but quickly after they became Christians, I realized, they really need more stories. And so they learned how to tell stories, they learned how to craft stories, which we're going to get into. They took stories and they would tell them to people. But our church services, this was probably one of the most unique things that we did with stories, is that we didn't have a church service like any other church service that I've been to up until this point. Each week, one of those 4 young guys would learn a new story, and they would tell the story to the people who had gathered on the front porch of somebody's house for church. And then when we came home on stateside, and when we came back to the field after our first stateside assignment, they explained to us that they had modified what church looked like. And so I was interested to see what this looked like. So here's totally indigenous, their model. Each week, one of those 4 would tell a new story, and then everybody at church would also have to tell a story. So they would either tell the story that was just told. If they didn't have a new story, they would tell the story that was just told, or they would tell a story that had previously been told. And so this sounds really laborious to us, but for them it was fun. And the same thing with prayer requests. So when we'd have prayer requests, they would say a prayer, and then everybody would stop and pray for that prayer request, and then somebody else would have a prayer request. And so our services were not 30 minutes, and they were not an hour. They went on for a long time. And even the children who came would either have a new story or a story they've learned in the past, or if they didn't know one, they would listen to the story that was just told and then try to retell it. So that's how church was done. So that was very different. Interestingly, there was another guy named Julian who had a horrible memory, and he always messed up the stories. And it became a joke. Like he would have, Job on the ark, and Paul was over in the Old Testament, and he'd just get names messed up. And so a common question we get about storying is, well, how do you make sure the story's correct? The cool thing is, everybody immediately, when Julian put Job on the ark, said, Julian, it's not Job. He said, oh, who was it? It's Noah. Oh, yeah, it was Noah.
So the community
of people always protected the story. And we had the benefit in our people group that we had some readers, we had some people that could read, but it wasn't that was dependent upon, people could always go back and check the stories, but they really enjoyed storytelling. It was much more than a learning style for them, because you would sit down and a Dominican would start telling a story about anything, anytime. So you'd sit down and it wouldn't be, they were all extroverted, very extroverted people, and they just loved to tell stories. And so it was a really natural fit for us.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. Well, that's a good introduction to both to Dr. Barger and to the concept of orality. Tomorrow, or in the next session, we're going to be talking in more detail about how you craft a story, how you put it together, and how you actually tell it. So I look forward to that. Thank you.
Thank you.
See you tomorrow.